Hi, I'm Guy Powell, and welcome to the next episode of The Backstory on the Shroud of Turin. If you haven't already done so, please visit guypowell.com and sign up for more episodes. I am the author of the upcoming book, The Only Witness, a historical fiction tracing a possible history of the Shroud over the last 2 millennia. Today, I'm speaking with Joe Marino. He's one of the preeminent researchers on the Shroud of Turin. We'll be talking about his most recent book that he just published, and it's titled The 1988 C14 Dating of the Shroud of Turin, a stunning expose. And I must say it's fascinating read. There's some interesting politics in here, and I look forward to talking about that. But before we get started, I just wanted to tell a short story, and that is that similar to Joe, it sounds like, but I remember just barely hearing the news about the radiocarbon testing that was done on the Shroud, and that it was announced, and then it was kind of shown that the Shroud may not be authentic. And I kind of tucked that away, and I said, oh, okay, so it's not authentic or whatever. I didn't really worry about it. But about 10 years later, my brother gave me a book from Ian Wilson, The Blood in the Shroud. He said, Guy, you got to read this. It's fascinating. And I started reading it, and really from the first page, I was absolutely hooked. And actually, my book follows a lot of the history that's in the Blood in the Shroud by Ian Wilson. And then I was just talking with a friend of mine, and when I told him about my book on the Shroud, he says, oh, I thought that Shroud was debunked as being fake. Didn't they do some testing on it? And then I had to say, no, but I'm going to be talking with the guy that really knows his stuff around radiocarbon dating, and that's Joe Marino. And so, and that actually is not why the Shroud and its authenticity should be debunked, but really why the radiocarbon testing should be debunked. And so with that, let me introduce Joe Marino. And let me give you his bio, and then we'll get right to it. So Joe Marino has a BA in Theological Studies from St. Louis University. He is a long-time syndenologist, and that means he studies the Shroud. He's researched and written and lectured extensively on the Shroud of Turin since 1977, which is actually before one of the major research studies that took place for the Shroud. And right now, he currently works at the Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio. So as early as 1977, a few years longer than me, but he's been at it certainly a lot longer and a lot more in detail. He has been fascinated with a book that he read, so similar to my background. And since then, he's been hooked, kind of just like me. 1997, he received a call from a Sue Benford, and she informed him of her spiritual insights about the Shroud. And after many discussions, and I really want to hear about that, with phone calls and emails about the Shroud, he began to experience God in a whole new way. And he felt powerfully drawn to leave the monastery and pursue Shroud research and other spiritual paths with Sue Benford. And definitely looking forward to hearing more about that. So Marino believes the Shroud can be shown to be the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. So he and me, we are definitely believers that the Shroud is the true and authentic burial cloth. But that would only make it an interesting archaeological object in his mind. And he believes that there's actually a lot more important spiritual messages that it can bring. And as a former Benedictine monk and Catholic priest, Joe believes that organized religion has often depicted Jesus as an unreachable deity whose standards we can never reach. Well, with his work, he hopes to show that the Shroud represents a more human Jesus, one who is someone we can not only approach, but as indicated in the Gospel of John, a person we can even surpass in doing great things. It is his hope and desire that their work together with Sue Benford can get this message across, and it is his belief that this is the destiny to which he has been called, which is why he's been given the passion he possesses for the Shroud. So with that, let me welcome Joe, and thank you so much for being being here. So glad to have you. And so let's get started. So say hello, maybe just say a couple of words, and then if you wouldn't mind, tell us a little bit about that backstory in 1977, what that book was and how you really got so involved and enamored, and it drove your passion with the Shroud.
Sure. I was born and raised Catholic, went to Catholic grade school and high school. And I had never been taught in school anything about the Shroud of Turin. Of course, I've learned most Catholics are familiar with the story of the Veil of Veronica, which is not in the Bible. Some people think it's actually in the Bible, but it's part of Catholic tradition, but not actually in the Bible. And that story is that a woman on the way on Jesus's path to the cross wiped his face, and there was an image found on that cloth afterwards. And that's probably an etiological story, possibly generated to explain how we had a facial image on the shroud, which of course is a long cloth. But Ian Wilson, among others, believed that the shroud was folded, at least part of its history, so that only the face was showing. So we have a cloth and you got an image on it. How did it get on there? And so even the name sort of kind of gives a clue that it's probably a story, because the name Veronica is made up of Vera icon, which means true image. So there's several different versions of that story. That's Veronica's her name in one of the stories. So that's something to consider. So in 1977, I had become shortly after high school, I guess I kind of became agnostic, but in the mid 70s, I started reading a lot about various religions and philosophy, not necessarily just Christian. And whenever I went to a bookstore, I would always go to the religions section first. So it was spring of 77, and I went to a mall near my house and went to the bookstore and went to the religion section and saw a paperback that had just the facial image of Jesus from the shroud. This is the image that looks lifelike. Now, and we can get into this later, but what you see on the shroud with the naked eye is not the same as what you see when you take a picture of it. It's very indistinct to the naked eye, but when you take a picture of it on the negative, it becomes lifelike. So the shroud image itself is like a photographic negative itself. But anyway, the face on the cover of the book, which was called the Fifth Gospel, and it asked, "Is this the face of Jesus Christ?" by Thomas Humber. And I thought, well, this looks like interesting reading. So it was a short paperback, probably, I don't know, a little less than 200 pages or something. But I bought it, took it home, read it in one sitting, and was just absolutely fascinated with it. Now, this was before the STURP team went over in 78 and gathered a lot of the information that suggested it was authentic. But even at that point, it was pretty well known in Europe, in the 30s and 40s, where it really didn't become known in the United States until the late 70s, when STURP started getting ready to go over to Turin to study it. So I read the book in one sitting and was convinced, just by the evidence that was available at the time, that the shroud very well could be authentic. So I started gathering articles and other books that I could get my hands on. There wasn't very much in those days, but I gathered what I could. And there was a shroud organization in the United States called the Holy Shroud Guild in Esopus, New York, which had been there since, I guess, the 1950s. But a lot of people didn't know about it. I wasn't aware of it until I read this book. And I contacted them and got some slides and started writing the scientists and things like that. and became more and more convinced the more I read that it was probably authentic, and nothing has come along since to convince me that that isn't the case.
Yeah, I agreed. Although, certainly the radiocarbon dating from '88 certainly slowed things down, and I'm sure it put a damper on things. And now your book, it primarily deals with that April 21, 1988 event, and I really liked how you set it up with the build up to that, and then the date itself, and then the after that. But why don't you tell us a little bit about the genesis of your book and what motivated you to write that and get all of the detail and what have you?
Well, like I say, because I had been familiar with all the other evidence of the shroud and was pretty convinced that it was probably authentic, when the carbon dating results came out in 1988 and said it was medieval, I just, if I didn't know a lot about the shroud, I might have been like you did, just to say, oh, it can't be authentic. But it was sort of like I just knew too much to accept that, and I just felt in my bones that something had to be wrong with that C14 dating. And I was aware of a little bit of the politics beforehand, but I had no idea until I started collecting, gathering, compiling all the evidence that came out afterwards, and how chaotic and crazy the whole thing was. So I knew that something had to be wrong with that, and pretty soon I was getting so much information I couldn't even keep it straight in my head. So in 2016, I decided to write a 3-part article, which is published on Barry Schwartz's Shroud.com site. And then you mentioned I work at Ohio State. I'm actually retired now. I retired in 2018 and started writing a lot of articles and stuff. And then I decided, a co-author of mine on one of my articles, not the 3-part article, but another one. He's a retired NASA scientist, and he says, you ought to write a book about the C14 affair. And I thought, well, I've already got a 3-part article, which was like about 175 pages. I thought, well, a good chunk of it's already written, so I think a book does need to be written. So I started expanding that and expanding it, and ended up with 800 pages in the book. And I knew there would be more material after I published it. So I dedicated a page on my website for the overflow, make corrections, additions, etc. So I've got about 80 additional entries in that. And I also reproduced that. It's not only available on my website, but I also made a separate supplement article on academia.edu for the overflow. And all of it's done in chronological order. As you say, I kind of give some back history of how the test was requested by people over the years, and the development of new methods in C14 dating, and the meetings that were held to try to decide how to best do that. And unfortunately, science got lost in the shuffle. There were just political agendas, egos, church politics, personality conflicts, and I've arranged it in chronological order, and you can kind of see a progression of mishaps that started really before the testing. And for example, in 1986, they had a 3-day meeting in Turin to try to decide the best protocol. And they went through multiple protocols. And then on April 21st, even though they had a 3-day meeting in 86 and to decide where the sample would be taken, etc., they spent 1 to 2 hours arguing and deciding where the sample would be taken. It was like they completely ignored the fact that they spent 3 days in Turin trying to figure that out before they got there. When Stirp went over to Turin in 1978, they started preparing like a year and a half ahead of time, and they were very rigorous in their testing. Well, the Italian authorities and the church authorities did not do a very good job of coordinating all the efforts. The experts said, whatever you do, don't take the sample from the lower left corner because it looks like that area may have been repaired. And guess where they took the sample from? The lower left corner, where it was probably repaired, which has led a lot to the problems that we have nowadays. So I just thought the book was really designed not for breezy type reading. It's kind of heavy stuff at times, but I really wanted to do a reference type work to have all the available data that I could get my hands on to show how poorly done the C14 test was actually done. And ironically, even after all that, they may have gotten fairly close to the date, 1260 to 1390, but it's another thesis of mine, and my wife helped me on, the fact that we think that the sample that they used had been repaired in the 16th century, so that the corner that they sampled was a combination of the original 1st century cloth and a later 16th century repair, which would possibly give you that 1260 to 1390 date.
Right. And actually, that brings up a couple of interesting questions. And as I was doing research, you have the Port Clare sisters that did the repair of due to the fire damage out of the Chambéry church. And then there was also a handful of references to a Father Valpre who may have done some repairs, and his repairs were where the Port Clare sisters, their repairs look like they're more obvious. They're more or less sewn in big spots to fill in holes, and then they, as I understand it, they added the Holland cloth behind it. Whereas Father Valpre actually tried to use this French weave method and otherwise. Tell us a little bit about both of those, or potentially other sources of where those repairs might have come from.
Yeah, there's kind of a big misconception about our theory in that, the Port Clare nuns did do repairs on the shroud in 1534, which was 2 years after the 1532 fire that is well known. They sewed in the big patches that are very visible on the shroud. Sue and I do not think they were skilled enough to actually do what's called an invisible reweave. But the shroud at the time was actually owned by Margaret of Austria, who was related to Savoy family, which had the shroud for hundreds of years before it was willed to the Vatican in the 1980s. Margaret of Austria had access to the best weavers in Europe, and we think that some of the best weavers that she had access to were the ones, maybe one, maybe more, actually probably did the repairs on the shroud, probably around, possibly even before the fire of 1532, because those corners were gone before the fire anyway, so it would have been in need of repair even before the fire. So we think a French weaver, or possibly multiple ones, did the invisible French reweaving, probably around 1530. She, in her will of 1508, she wanted to give a piece of the shroud to one of the churches that she was affiliated with, and she died in 1530. So we think it was possibly done. The repairs could have been done, around the time of her death. And Sebastian Valfrey, Father Valfrey, did some later repairs. I would consider those relatively minor. I don't think he would have been talented enough to do the invisible reweave either, and I think they were just minor adjustments and repairs.
So now, when that reweave was done, was it done with linen, or was it done with cotton, or a mix of linen and cotton?
It seems, based on later scientific evidence, it would seem that it was done with a mixture of linen and cotton, because cotton is easier to dye, because not only do you have to add new cloth, but you have to make the color match, and linen doesn't accept dye as well as cotton does. So Ray Rogers, who was a chemist on the Stirp team, did find dye, mordants, glues, a splice thread. He basically found things that you would find if a repair had been in that area. And he was rather shocked, because he had accepted the carbon dating results. And then Sue and I presented a paper in Italy in 2000 saying that we believe that the area had been repaired. Well, interestingly enough, he was really the only one in the world at the time that could have proved or disproved it, because as the chemist on the Stirp team, he still had, legally and appropriately, he still had shroud samples from the main part of the cloth from 1978. He also had several threads from what is called the Reyes sample. Dr. Gilbert Reyes was a Belgian textile expert who was given a small sample in 1973 for textile analysis. And Rogers had some of those Reyes threads. Now, the Reyes threads were literally right next to the area from which the shroud, the C14 sample in 1988 was taken. So when we proposed our theory, Rogers said, well, I've got samples from the main part of the cloth, and I've got samples from the Reyes sample. I can compare them and disprove this in 5 minutes. So he called Barry Schwartz up, who had published our paper, and kind of gave him the riot act, because Ray Rogers thought it was nonsense. He said we were part of the lunatic fringe. And he got out his microscope and looked at the two samples from the two different areas, and he was shocked to find that they were different. And he called Barry back up and was kind of sheepish and said, I can't believe it. I think they're right.
How funny, how interesting. So, well, you mentioned the whole process, and one of the things I really found fascinating with your book was where to take the samples from, and I also like the control samples. And if you were to design that process, what would you have designed, given what you've read and stuff like that, as to how to take those samples and then how to then forward them on in such a fashion to the laboratories for testing?
Yeah, well, they don't have to get my opinion. They had actual experts that said, you need to take multiple samples from multiple different spots on the shroud, and given maybe they were going to take it from like 3 different spots on the cloth and give it to several different labs. Well, it ended up they only took the 1 sample and only chose the 3 labs. And the problem with that, of course, is with only 1 sample in one area, you cannot be sure
Yep.
that it's representative of the whole cloth. And they were advised to take multiple samples. And the reason they took just that sample was it was already cut on, because that's where they took the Reyes sample from. And they thought, well, let's not deface the cloth any more than we have to. So let's just take another sample from that area. But that was a big mistake, because you don't know if that area had been repaired. And there were known instances in which the shroud was repaired. And they simply should not have taken it from that area, and they did anyway. It was just one mishap after the other, and bad decision after bad decision.
Yeah, I chuckled when I was reading it, and I was like, oh my, I couldn't believe it. After they had a methodology and a whole process, and then the disguising samples with the Egyptian cloth and coming from different centuries, and then and then they didn't do that. They took it. Yeah. They took the 3 samples and the 1 sample, cut it in 3, and then that's what they sent off. I was really, I had to chuckle about that.
Yeah, and guess what? On the control samples, which are supposed to be unknown by the labs, they told them the dates of the samples beforehand.
Yep.
That's just bad science. The whole idea of controls is to see if the labs are accurate. You give them a sample that the date, but they don't. They give you the date. You see how accurate it is. Well, if you give them the dates beforehand, that's just an open door to fudge the data.
Yep.
You know?
Yep. And that's like, with drug testing. I mean, now certainly with COVID, is the double blinds with the placebos and everything. That there's a whole reason and a whole methodology there to make absolutely certain that you can test then each of those labs to make sure they get to the right dates for the samples that they've got. Yeah, fascinating. The other thing that I really, I don't know if I enjoyed it, but I definitely found it interesting was the different factions that had a totally different interest in what may have come out of the whole process, and then the argumentation between the Stirp group and then this, and then Archbishop Ballesteros, and then the Trondheim group, and then Dr. Gove and whatever. I mean, there were so many different factions. Who do you see as being maybe the top 3 or 4 factions in the whole thing as they to the lead up of the testing?
Well, Gove has to take kind of first place in terms of being the driver of who ended up testing the shroud. Stirp obviously had all the experience. They proposed in 1984 doing 26 different tests on the shroud, including the carbon-14. So when they proposed those tests, this is kind of funny. They put the tests in I think alphabetical order, and somebody got upset because carbon-14 wasn't the number 1, and Stirp said, "Well, we didn't put them in order of priority. They were in alphabetical order." So, there were just miscommunications like that. And Gove was the co-inventor of the new method that was used on the shroud in 1988. It was called AMS, Accelerator Mass Spectrometry. And, in the old days, you needed like a handkerchief size piece of the shroud, which is why they didn't do it in the earlier days, because they, understandably didn't want to take a super large chunk to date it. But with the new method, you could use, several threads. But keep in mind that in 1988, the method they used was only about 11 years old at the time, and had not widely been used on textiles yet. So it was still somewhat of an unproven method. So Gove was interested in kind of promoting this new method. And he thought that, well, why do all these other tests When we could do a carbon-14 and get the date, and if it comes out medieval, that means the shroud's a fake and you don't have to do all these other 25 tests, which is, it sounds scientific, but, and carbon-14 is not infallible. The public has this idea that, these labs do a date and it is accurate all the time. And if you examine the literature, you find a lot of carbon-14 dates that are just wrong. Sometimes they don't even know why they're wrong, but they get tossed if they don't match with other evidence. But Gove thought that Stirp was a bunch of religious fanatics, which was not true. The Stirp team had several devout Christians on the group, but for the most part, they were agnostic, at least one agnostic. They were atheists. They were Jews. They were nominal Christians. They were interested in finding out how the image got on the clock. That was their mission. And they've been unfairly targeted over the years, ever since Gove's been gone for about 15 years now. But he thought they were religious nuts. Other people still claim that. It's simply not true. And he managed, with the help of at least one church official, to get Stirp eliminated not only from the C14 test, but all the other 25 tests as well, which was just a huge mistake. Stirp knew the most about the shroud. They had expertise in most of the areas, and Stirp should have been allowed to lend their expertise, and they were not. And so the C14 labs took one bad sample. They gave it to 3 different labs. There's been several peer-reviewed articles that question the statistics that they gave out. They were originally asked for the raw data right after the experiment, which is typical in scientific experiments. They refused to give the data, which is suspicious.
Yeah.
And that was only released because of a Freedom of Information Act requested by a French researcher. And once they were released, it confirmed even more that the data that the labs released, there's something suspect about the numbers that they gave out. And as I say, they may have gotten close to the date if there's a reweave in there, but my stance is there was just so many mistakes and lack of rigor in the scientific experiment that whatever they came up with, I don't think you can trust. I just think you pretty much have to throw out the whole ball of information they gathered.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I gathered as I was reading through your notes, and also a bunch of other papers that, and also how could you, for me, I do a lot of data and analytics on in my own business, but you have to look at things in multiple ways, and you have to then almost triangulate into it. And if one of them is wrong, or not wrong but different, it doesn't necessarily mean that the other 25 are wrong. And so you have to look at all of them, and always go back and test your assumptions on one that might be an outlier. And so the radiocarbon dating, so many people thought that was the be all to end all, and yet to your point, it could easily be wrong. And reading your book, I was laughing at how poor the scientific rigor was, and even how they were taking videos of the sample taking, and then they turned the cameras off and turned them back on, and then distributed things, and then they told about the control. They told them the age of the controls. I was it's just amazing, just absolutely amazing. So the other thing too, I enjoyed Ray Rogers. I was reading some stuff on him a couple months ago, and one of the things that his tests, which I don't know why wouldn't be just as rigorous as the radiocarbon dating. Radiocarbon dating is basically a chemical test, and he was doing a chemical test, and he was looking at the vanillin and the lignin.
Right.
And that decays just like carbon-14 does. And and so that result, it's a chemical result. It shows that it's a totally different age, and so why wouldn't that be just as valid as anything else? So, but I do like your story. So, did you work with Ray Rogers much at all, or?
I never met him in person, but Sue and I, once he thought that we were right on our theory, we did communicate with him quite a bit via email. And in my first book, Wrapped Up in the Shroud, I have an appendix of a lot of the emails that we shared with him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I enjoyed reading some of the stuff on that. So I guess moving forward now, it's been almost 40 years, and it's kind of like the Israelites in the desert being there 40 years. What do you see as a probability that a repeat of the radiocarbon testing taking place? Do you think that'll happen, or do you think that's now out for a longer time?
There are a couple issues related to that. First one is that because the first one went so badly, some people are cautious or reluctant to want to do another one. And then a kind of a corollary to that is that there have been new dating methods, other methods that could possibly be used. There's an Italian scientist that has done some mechanical and other chemical tests, and he believes that his tests show that the shroud could date to the 1st century. A similar problem with these would be what I mentioned about the AMS method in 1988 being only 11 years old. These are relatively new methods as well, and it's probably not far enough along to know to gauge that it's probably authentic enough to accept. So maybe a few years down the road, that they'll have more data to back it up, and that if they do a test, the dates might be more reliable than what C14 can even do.
Are those destructive tests as well, or are they not?
Well, the way the Italian scientist did it, he used other textiles, and did some controls with those, and then extrapolated to images or to fibers on the shroud. So we're not, there have been no new samples taken from the shroud. It's just a shame that they sit on it, because science and technology has advanced light years since 1978. And there's just, the sky's the limit in terms of what they could find. And of course, the other issue is permission from the church. And, some of us in the shroud field have contacts with Italian researchers in Rome and Italy. And the word on the street, as they say, is that there will be no new testing with Pope Francis. Now he's got a background in chemistry. I mean, I would think he would be possibly one to want to see new chemical testing, but obviously he's got a lot on his plate. There are a lot of other problems to deal with, of course. But my take is that the shroud was allowed to be tested in 1978, and some great data was taken, and we're still using that today. It needs to be updated. I think the church screwed up the 1988 test. Then also there was they did a secret quote restoration in 2002, which upset people because they didn't consult other experts around the world. They just went ahead and did it. And so I think they really need to make up for, I feel, their mistakes in 88 and 2002, and let some new testing be done. So at this point, I think we're still looking, probably another 10 or 20 years possibly before Any new testing is done. Now we will have another public exposition of the Shroud in 2025. The Stirp study in 1978 was done in conjunction with the 78 exhibition. I don't know if that's going to be a factor in terms of if they're going to tie it with another exposition in the future or not. But I really do feel that the church owes it to the world to allow the Shroud to be tested. I believe the Shroud belongs to the world and not just the Catholic Church. Yeah.
No, thank you. Yeah, and I agree with that. It certainly is. It is to part of the world, and what an event. Well, I've got to. We're about end of our time here, and didn't want to close. But where can someone pick up your book? Where can they buy your latest book?
Both of my books are available on Amazon. If you do an author search on Joseph G. Marino, both books will come up. And as I say, a bonus with the C14 book is that I list in the preface, I believe, the URL for my website, where people can check out the 80 new entries that I've added. And I've also, anybody that buys a print copy can email me, and I will send them the electronic version of the book. And where that comes in handy is if with the long URLs, instead of having to type it manually from the book into your browser, you could go to your electronic version and just copy and paste it, and that will save some time. And it's easier for, if you want to do searching. I mean, the book does have an index, but you would have the added bonus of electronic searching the texts as well.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, and thank you for that. So now that you mentioned that, I'm gonna I'll need to get that link, because it does sound like it would be very helpful. So anyway, thank you so much, Joe. I really appreciate it, and potentially look forward to doing this again. And really appreciate your time today, and great insights, and love your insights not only on the carbon-14, but on the Shroud and on the politics and the church. And hopefully at some point, maybe in 10 years, and maybe when the Israelites or the Shroudists get out of the desert, then we'll have a new round of testing on it and be able to hopefully debunk that one test and come up with other tests that are going to be more reliable and more and just better to be able to prove that the Shroud is truly authentic. One little story before I close. One of the things that I think is one of the most joyous events for me is we do at our church, we do a Christmas and a Christmas service, and we do an Easter service. And on both of those, we have all of the ages of kids singing. And there's nothing more fun and joyous than that. And when I think about the Shroud as being the only witness to the resurrection, the actual resurrection of Jesus Christ, that's really a very joyous thing. So with that, again, thank you, Joe, and we'll go from there. And so glad you were able to listen and be part of this next episode of the backstory of the Shroud of Turin.
Well, thanks, guys. I enjoyed it, and I appreciate you having me.
Thank you.